welcome to Catholics Coast to Coast, where each week, Hanging Out Podcast Central gives us a chance to really dive deeper into conversations that you may not be aware of that could help to bring you closer to God and allow you opportunities to be able to know and understand the Catholic faith better. I am Ace McKay, always glad to hang out, and as we dive into this week's conversations, let's first stop by and check in with our Word on the Word for the readings for this weekend's Mass.
Hi, I'm Veronica, and this is Melissa. Today, we're going to take a look at the second reading for this Sunday.
It comes from the letter to the Hebrews, and the writer talks about how Jesus is the perfect person to imitate. And, I'm gonna stop for a second here, because, a few weeks ago, the music interrupted me. I don't really want that to happen again, so I'm just going to sit here and wait and cue the maestro. One of my favorite things to learn about is the saints. There's so many of them, and each one is so unique.
The line that stood out to me in this week's reading is, "We are surrounded by so great a cloud of witness." The writer's talking about his immediate Christian peers, but I think we could also apply it to the saints.
Even though the saints are great role models, the writer reminds us that Jesus is the perfect person to imitate. And reflecting on his passion also gives us the strength to endure the trials in our lives. The saints are great, and that's because they imitated Christ too.
And this week, we challenge you to take a look at how your favorite saint imitated Christ. Maybe there's a way you could use their example to follow Christ more closely. Melissa, I don't think I know this answer, actually. Who's your favorite saint?
Saint Clare of Assisi.
Oh, that's a good one.
Thanks. What about you?
Oh, Saint Monica. And tell us who your favorite saint is in the comments below.
And we'll see you next week here on The Word on the Word.
Toodles.
Bye.
Helping you better understand the Mass readings for this weekend. That is, of course, Word on the Word. Easy to find when you go to EWTN.com/podcast or simply find Word on the Word wherever you like to stream. I'm Ace McKay. As Catholics Coast to Coast continues, we dive deep into this week's podcast, literally of the same name. What does the Catholic Church teach about smoking, whether it's marijuana, cigarettes, or even drinking alcohol? And is it morally okay? We're going to find out where that gray line is in this week's Dive Deep episode on this week's Catholics Coast to Coast.
Smoking marijuana, smoking a cigarette, consuming alcohol. Are they morally okay? This is Dive Deep. From the Diocese of Springfield in Illinois, this is Dive Deep. We dive deep into our Catholic faith. I am Andrew Hansen, pleased to be joined today by Bishop Thomas John Paprocki. Bishop Paprocki, good to see you. How are you?
I'm doing fine, thanks, Andrew. How are you?
I'm excellent. Always good to be with you so you can set us straight in terms of all these difficult Catholic Church teachings that sometimes the secular media gets wrong, or our non-Catholic friends seem to not know exactly what we're thinking. But even us in the Catholic Church, sometimes we don't get it wrong. And today we're talking about some of these vices you hear. Marijuana, cigarettes, alcohol. We're going to talk about how much is too much. Is there a moral line? Is there a moral equivalency between the three? So the first thing I want to talk about first is marijuana, because this is something we've seen states across the country have legalized marijuana. Here in Illinois, we're one of those states. What is the Catholic Church's position on marijuana and smoking it?
Well, before I answer that question, I want to say for the record here that I've never smoked marijuana. So I'm not speaking from personal experience here, but I don't think you necessarily need personal experience to know that something is not good for you. For example, I've never smoked cigarettes either, and I'm the son of a pharmacist, and so we literally grew up above the store, but trying to help people to be healthy. And so I think to answer that question then more directly is that the Church teaches that we are stewards of our bodies. God created us in His image and likeness, and we should take care of our bodies as best we can. And so there are a number of ways that we take care of our bodies and a number of ways that we can abuse our bodies. And so using a drug like marijuana, and I describe it as a drug basically, is a drug that I know there are some medical experts that push a medicinal purpose for it, but I think for many people the issue is not so much whether or not it's being used for a medicinal purpose for somebody that's dealing with a great deal of pain or something like that. That's a whole different story, and I'm not a doctor either. But I would say in the general sense, if people are using marijuana to get high, as a recreational drug, then I think that the church is teaching in terms of promoting virtues like temperance and the virtue of being healthy, of not injecting things into our bodies that are going to be detrimental to our health. So I think that would be the first principle to be mindful of.
But you said there is a difference between using marijuana recreational for getting high versus using it for medicinal purposes. There is a moral line. There is something that separates those two.
I would say yes. Now, again, does it help medicinally or not? I'm not a doctor nor even a pharmacist at this point. But whether or not there are medicinal benefits to that, I'm kind of skeptical of that. I think there are plenty of other kinds of medications in terms of pain relief, but I guess I don't even want to speculate on that in a sense. So if there are medical experts that feel in their medical opinion that cannabis can be helpful for people in certain situations, well, that would be a different story. That would, as opposed to someone who is just wanting to use smoke marijuana to get high, and that would be, in that sense, it would be contrary to a number of points. One would be in terms of taking care of your own body, because I think, as I understand, inhaling any kind of smoke is not going to be good for your body, whether that's marijuana or just cigarettes. And that's why I've never smoked cigarettes either. I've never been attracted to that, but also just the sense that that's not healthy. I generally try to lead a healthy lifestyle. I watch what I eat and what I drink, and I exercise regularly. I run almost every day. I've been a marathon runner, so I think that that's being a good steward. God created us in His image and likeness, as I said, and so we are stewards of His creation, and so to take care of our bodies in that sense, that's the first thing. But then also, there's the implications for loving God and loving our neighbor. So loving God is that's the first part of it. Is God. We're loving God by respecting His creation, but also loving neighbor. So if we're getting high for the purpose of point of getting high, that's kind of a selfish motivation. I'm doing this for myself, but then there's also the risk of, well, if you're getting high and you're driving, then you're talking another whole layer of moral difficulty. Whether we're talking about getting high with marijuana or getting high on drinking, if you're high and you're driving, I would describe that as sinful, definitely sinful, because you're putting perhaps your own life as well as other people's lives at risk, and that would be sinful behavior.
And you kind of, a good bridge now for my next question is there a moral difference between getting high on marijuana and getting drunk on alcohol?
I'd say qualitatively no. That if that's your intention, now my understanding is that most people use recreational marijuana. That's the whole point of using marijuana, is to get high. Drinking alcohol is not necessarily to get high. In many situations, it's a social a beverage that people use maybe to relax a little bit more, but not necessarily to get high, or certainly not to get drunk. So if the intention is, I'm going to sit down with a bottle of whiskey and get myself drunk, well, then I think that's the equivalent of smoking to get marijuana to get high, because you're doing something that is intentionally harmful to you and potentially could be harmful to others. So a person who is intentionally getting drunk, if that person is a married person, well then there's or it has children, then there's the implications of what does that do to your spouse and to your children even if you're sitting at home drinking alone. But your family's around, your spouse is there, and your children are there. And what kind of example are you giving your children if they see their mother or father is sitting there intentionally getting drunk? That's a very bad example for children. But then also, I think that the lowered inhibition of somebody who's been drinking, though, also in many cases is an entree for domestic violence. That with the inhibitions being lowered and getting into saying things that maybe are antagonistic and then getting into some kind of a situation of domestic violence. I mean, there's just there's all kinds of negative ramifications that can spiral out of that.
Now I want to kind of split the difference here between, being just sober and getting high or getting drunk. You heard the phrase getting buzzed, getting a nice buzz going. Cigarettes, alcohol, I know you mentioned people who usually use marijuana are using it to get high, but is there some moral leniency if you are using these types of substances to just, and for lack of a word, get a nice buzz going? Or is that now just a gray area where you kind of have to use your own prudential judgment?
Yeah, I mean, there probably would be gradations in that, between is it sinful, and then is it mortal sin, or is it a venial sin? So if you're doing something that is very seriously wrong, getting a buzz or just a mild high from something is not necessarily going to be a mortal sin to do that, but it could be a venial sin in the sense of that it's still doing something that's detrimental to you and to your body. If you're in a state of being high, again, whether it's alcohol or marijuana, and then you get in the car and drive somewhere, well, that could be verging on a very serious sin because then you are putting people's lives at risk, and we probably all know people that have been killed in auto accidents is because they were hit by a drunk driver, and that case, I would say it certainly is literally a mortal sin because you've taken someone's life.
Now, as I mentioned at the top, there are a lot of states who have legalized marijuana. This is kind of an issue that's going on in our country for several years now. What if you're personally against marijuana, but you're okay with it being legalized? Is there any problem there from a moral perspective?
Well, I'm not sure why, if you're against it, if you would be.
No, against you don't want to use it.
You don't want to use it
personally. Yeah, it's like I don't use
okay.
it, but you think it's okay if others people. Is there a moral problem from a Catholic perspective with that line of thinking?
Well, I guess it raises the question, why don't you want to use it? It's just a matter of preference. I mean, for me, it would be, I don't want to use it because I think there's something not good about it. So in that sense, it's not, for me, it's not just a matter of a moral preference, a personal preference that I just don't like. I don't like cigarettes, I don't like marijuana, so I don't use them. But if you want to use it, fine. Personally, I grew up, I went to college in the 1970s, and that was, high school, late 60s, early 70s, and that's where a lot of people started, experimenting with marijuana. So, I mean, from my own background, it was a negative thing. It was kind of looked down upon. It was pejorative. That was not a good thing. If you were somebody that regularly smoked marijuana, the pejorative phrase was your pothead, so it was not something that was looked at as very aspirational. So I guess I have a hard time kind of comprehending why someone would say, well, I don't want to use it, but I think it's okay if you do, because my approach would be, I don't want to use it because I think it's not a good thing, so I don't think you should use it either, because I don't think it'd be healthy for you to do that.
Now, I want to also talk about food, because this is kind of at least a little bit in this arena of, how much is too much. You mentioned being good stewards of our body. What about eating junk food or eating too much food? Is that also, where's the moral line there? You talk about being sinful. Is that in the same arena as smoking marijuana and drinking alcohol to get drunk?
Well, I think it's weighing the capital sin that we call gluttony with the virtue that counteracts that, which is temperance. And so gluttony is eating for the pleasure of eating, and overeating or over drinking. That also applies to that. Whereas temperance is the virtue of doing all things in moderation. So, for example, in terms of is it a sin to have a donut or to eat some pretzels or potato chips? No, it's not. I mean, if you're having lunch and you have a bag of potato chips, that's with the sandwiches, that's fine. But it's another thing to sit down with a whole big bag of potato chips or pretzels. I'm going to devour this, and then if it's just indulging your pleasures because you love those pretzels so much, I'm just going to keep eating them until I finish this whole bag of family size pretzels or something, well, then I think then that's verging on the sin of gluttony. But I think that's what temperance says. There's a difference between temperance and abstinence. Abstinence is you don't use it at all. So the movement for abstinence from alcohol is those who say you shouldn't drink any alcohol at all. And that certainly was a strong movement in our country back during Prohibition. But I think today would be seen as, a temperance would mean that, all right, you're at a party, a social gathering, and they're serving alcohol. You can have a drink or two, but temperance would say, okay, you got to know at what point you don't cross the line, especially if you're going to be driving home. Don't have so much alcohol that you're going to be impaired and unable to drive unless you have somebody else driving for you. Yeah.
Now, my last question for you, a lot of what we're talking about, people can become addicted to it. All these alcohol, drugs, eating too much, eating bad. What would be your answer from a spiritual perspective? If someone is struggling from an addiction, what's your advice for us from a spiritual level to try to break free from that?
Well, if you're talking about addictions, usually you need help with that, So on a spiritual level, of course, the help of grace, but on a more practical level, maybe to talk about the help of other people, So for example, we have groups like Alcoholics Anonymous or 12-step programs where people can get assistance with that. So, and I think that's an important point to keep in mind too with regard to marijuana, because I know there are some advocates for the use of recreational marijuana that see it as simply as recreational, and it doesn't lead to any further harm. Well, again, I'm not a doctor, but I have heard from some experts that say that's not exactly true. That marijuana use does in some cases lead to other more serious drug use and addictions. And the same could be said for alcohol. I mean, because we know alcoholism is a disease. Some people can have one or two drinks and it's no problem. Another person, one drink is, if that person is an alcoholic, one drink, they can't stop after one drink, because of the addiction. And so someone who is aware of being an alcoholic has to be abstinent and say, well, I can't have any alcohol at all. And so, but that's very difficult, again, for a person to do on his or her own. And so that's why, groups such as Alcoholics Anonymous or, any 12-step program are there to give people support and dealing with an addiction.
What's interesting about this conversation, Bishop, is I feel like what you're telling us is a complete mind shift in terms of taking care of our bodies, where, yes, you want to not do these things to be healthy, physically healthy, but we have to remember our bodies are a gift from God and we are entrusted to take care of them. And so I find it fascinating to listen to and to remember that we need to have kind of that mind shift change to recognize that we need to take care of our bodies, not only to be healthy, but because God calls us to be healthy. So really interesting stuff, Bishop Paprocki. Is there anything else you wanted to add on that?
I just want to say that really fits in our diocese what we've been talking about in terms of stewardship. We tend to think stewardship sometimes is associated with the financial aspect of that. We're stewards of God's creation. Well, so our material goods, like our money, we have to be good stewards of that, and that certainly is true. But we're also stewards in terms of what God created us, and so we're stewards of God's creation in terms of our own bodies. And so I think that sense of healthy living, of exercising and eating and drinking properly, I think those are all aspects of good stewardship.
Excellent. Good stuff. Bishop Paprocki, thanks for coming on Dive Deep.
You're welcome.
All right. For more podcasts, head over to our YouTube page, youtube.com/Dio Springfield. And until next time, we'll see you right here on Dive Deep.
The moral lines of smoking, drinking, helping you to better understand it for your individual walk. Dive Deep is available at Podcast Central when you go to EWTN.com/podcast, or find Dive Deep wherever you stream. And of course, that way you don't miss future episodes. I am Ace McKay. When Catholics Coast to Coast continues, the Jimmy Akin Podcast, who you may know from Catholic Answers Live, he is actually going to give us two passages in the gospel where Jesus talks about his church, but surprisingly, It is the amount in which we learn from them, so that as Jimmy looks deeper into these passages, it reveals that Jesus understood his own church and compares this with the popular ideas about the church and the non-Catholic communities. Let's dive into that with the Jimmy Akin Podcast next on Catholics Coast to Coast.
The destination for great Catholic audio programming is EWTN Podcast Central, featuring the best of EWTN radio, as well as faith-filled podcasts from our friends and affiliates across the nation, all in one place, all free. If it's central to the faith, you can find it on EWTN Podcast Central. It's like podcast heaven. Visit EWTN.com/radio/podcasts today.
And now, another soulful psalm from Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers.
And this segment of the show is its own podcast. That's right. You can go to Podcast Central at EWTN.com, or you can go to the EWTN app, or even to Spotify or iTunes or SoundCloud, whatever your favorite music platform is, and listen to the soulful psalms. All right. Today, we're going to take a look at Psalm 85, at least begin to look at Psalm 85. So Psalm 85 is in Book 3 of the Psalms. And so books in Book 3 of the Psalms, 73 to 83 are the of the sons of Korah. Are Asaph. And in 84, 85, 87, and 88 are the sons of Korah. 86 is David. And 88 is also one of the Ezrahite writers, Haman, and 89 is Etan. So a lot of different writers in this section of Book 3 of the Psalms. But today, the prescript is very, very simple. It's the entire first verse, the prescript or the superscript. It says, "For the choir master of the sons of Korah, a psalm." Now remember, Korah rebelled against Moses and Aaron in Numbers chapter 16. It says, and when they rebelled against Moses and Aaron, it said the ground opened and Korah and his family went down alive to Sheol. And the followers of Korah were swallowed up by fire from heaven. The only ones that survived were the sons of Korah, which were the followers, not the familial family of Korah, because they all died, but the ones who did not fall away and did not rebel. We see them in Number chapter 26, verse 11. And so these sons of Korah were not only superintendents of the musical guild of the Jewish temple, they were also caretakers and custodians of the sacred vessels and vestments used in the worship of God. And Korah means baldness in Hebrew. All right, so let's dive in. O Lord, you have favored your land and brought back the captives of Jacob. So this psalm obviously was written then coming out of the captivity of Israel, probably from the Babylonian captivity. You forgave the guilt of your people and covered all their sins. You averted all your rage. You turned back the heat of your anger. So here we see it again. God is pure love. Okay, God doesn't have emotions or feelings, but the Israelites do this all throughout the Psalms. They often ascribe human feelings and emotions to God trying to describe what they're going through themselves. So when they were in captivity and they were exiled from their homeland, they felt that God abandoned them, that their sins, that they turned away from God, and God allowed the natural outcome of their decisions to play out, which is, okay, you don't want me to rule over you? Okay, Babylon will. And they got taken into captivity. Their worship was destroyed. But now God has brought them back and restored them again. So that feeling is like, you forgave us. You covered their sins. So again, forgiveness. God forgave them for their misdeeds, which is why Jesus died on the cross. The ultimate sign of the forgiveness of sins, dying dying to sin and rising to new life in Christ, right? Beautifully symbolized by Christ on the cross. He goes, you averted all your rage, you turned back the heat of your anger. So it felt like God was angry at them, right? When they were going through that, it felt like God was angry. But now he said, oh, you've lifted your anger from us now, oh God, right? So again, ascribing human feelings to God. Then he continues in verse 5. Bring us back, O God, our Savior. Put an end to your grievance against us. Will you be angry with us forever? Will your anger last from age to age? Right? So they're, again, beseeching God, how long is this going to last? We see this theme a lot in the Psalms where first they're extolling God and then they're reminding God of the situation they find themselves in, and then they're asking God to restore them, to save them. And God did hear their voice, not only by bringing them out of captivity, but sending Jesus. Right? That's the ultimate freedom from captivity. That's the ultimate freedom from the slavery of sin, is Jesus Christ, the way, the truth, and the life. So when we read these Psalms, we read them what's called Christologically or allegorically. So we see our life in Christ in these Psalms. Right? So yes, these Psalms were written long before Jesus was born, obviously. But when we read them now, we read them with perspective. We see them, our life, also in the pages of the Psalms, right? So we imagine we're the psalmist writing, Lord, I'm going through something difficult. I need you right now. Restore me to life. I feel like I'm dying. Restore me to life. Restore my life from the grave. I'm on the brink of the grave, right? We've all been there. We've all gone through something like that. And that's why I love the way, again, the humanists of this, they're asking questions. Lord, how long is this going to last? Are you going to be angry with me forever? Right? It's kind of like that with your wife, isn't it? Or your spouse. It's like, how long are you going to be angry at me? You haven't been talking to me for a while. How long is this going to go on? Right? You're like, okay, like, how long are you going to be mad at me? It's the same kind of thing with God, right? Especially with someone that you love. Gosh, you don't want them to be angry. You don't want them to feel that way, right? So you ask, how long will your anger last from age to age? See, so it's not just a matter of something's happening to me. Is this something that's going to go on forever? Because it seems like this is never going to end.
For more on the Psalms with Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers, check out Beacon of Truth weekdays at 4 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio and streaming everywhere you listen to podcasts.
The concept of the Christian church is one of the most prominent concepts in the New Testament. Church and churches are mentioned more than 100 times, but there are only 2 passages where Jesus speaks about his church. And from these 2 passages, we can learn a surprising amount about Jesus' church and how he intended it to be, including some things that would surprise many Christians today. Let's get into it. Howdy, folks. You can help me keep making this podcast, and you can get early access to new episodes by going to patreon.com/Jimmy Akin Podcast. Today, there are countless churches in the world. Some of them are huge with thousands of members, while others are tiny with less than a dozen members. There are also numerous kinds of churches. Some of them are Catholic churches, Eastern Orthodox churches, Oriental Orthodox churches, and the many different kinds of Protestant churches. The most historic Christian churches, those that arose before Protestantism did, hold that Christ founded what is sometimes called a visible church, that is, an institution that has clearly defined borders, whose members have been baptized into it or received into it after baptism. They may be good or bad members, faithful or faithless members, but they're still members. It's also understood that this visible church has clearly defined leaders who, since the time of the apostles, have been the bishops, and that these leaders have the authority to make binding laws for those subject to them. On the other hand, a popular theory in the Protestant community is that Christ did not found a visible church. Instead, he founded what is sometimes called an invisible church. Such a church would not have such clearly defined boundaries. Instead, it would be an invisible spiritual union of all true believers in Christ, whether or not they'd been baptized. And these members would be spread throughout all the different churches and denominations that exist in the world today. This complicates the issues of the church's leadership and laws. I mean, if Christ's church is merely an invisible spiritual union of all believers across denominational lines, then a believer who is disciplined by one set of leaders for misconduct in breaking the group's laws could simply pull up stakes and join another, more congenial denomination where he won't be subject to discipline because the laws are different. But we'll set aside that issue and ask a different question. Which of the two positions, the visible church idea or the invisible church idea, is what Christ actually intended? And can we learn anything else about what Jesus intended his church to be? As surprising as it may be, there are only two passages in the Gospels where Jesus refers to his church using the term church, or ecclesia in Greek. He refers to his church in other ways in other passages, but here we're going to be focusing on when Jesus uses the actual term church. The first of these passages is in Matthew 16, where Jesus tells Peter, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." We've talked about this passage in previous episodes. For example, in episode 36, we saw that there are structural features in the text that demand that Peter be the rock about which Jesus is speaking. I won't go through all those again today, but you can check out episode 36 to see the proof for yourself. We also talked about the passage in episode 37, where we showed that when the New Testament speaks about the foundation of the church in 5 different passages, that it uses 5 different metaphors. So you can't take the metaphor that's used in one passage and stuff it into another. You must allow the metaphor used here in Matthew 16 to say that Peter really is the rock in the sense that this passage is talking about. Once again, you can check out episode 37 to hear the case for yourself. Finally, we also discussed this passage in episode 41, where we saw that 3 of the 4 Gospels contain passages in which Jesus gives Peter a unique leadership role among the 12 apostles. And there's even a reason why the remaining Gospel doesn't contain such a passage. The upshot of all this is that when Jesus says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church," he really is giving Peter a unique and foundational role as the leader of the church. Once Jesus goes back to heaven, Peter is in charge of the earthly church. So that's the first thing we learn from the passages where Jesus discusses his church. Christ's church is founded on Peter. And since Peter is being appointed leader, we also learn that Christ's church has leaders. There's also something else that we learn from this statement, since Christ says that the gates of Hades will not prevail against his church. Modern people aren't that familiar with the idea of Hades, but in Greek thought, Hades was the place of the dead, not the place of the damned, just the place of all the dead. The phrase gates of Hades appears in the Septuagint Greek version of Isaiah 38, where the prophet records a prayer given by King Hezekiah after he nearly died from an illness. King Hezekiah prayed, "I said, at the top of my days, at the gates of Hades, I will leave my remaining years. I said, I will certainly not see the salvation of God any longer in the land of the living." Here, King Hezekiah speaks about how, in the middle of his days, his illness nearly brought him to the gates of Hades, or death. He thought that he would no longer see the salvation of God in the land of the living. Passing through the gates of death, he would drop all his remaining years at the gates, all the extra years he should have lived, and he would enter the realm of the dead. The gates of Hades thus represent passing from life to death, and so, by saying the gates of Hades will not prevail against his church, Jesus indicates that his church will never die. So we can add to our list, Christ's church will never die. And that means Christ's church has been around since the 1st century. We can now turn to the next line of what Jesus says to Peter, which begins, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." Both Protestant and Catholic Bible scholars recognize this as an allusion to a passage in Isaiah 22, which is the only place in the Old Testament where a key is used as a symbol. In Isaiah's day, the royal house of David was overseen by one of the servants of the king named Shebna, but God was not pleased with Shebna, so he sent Isaiah to prophesy, "Thus says the Lord God of hosts, Come, go to this steward, to Shebna, who is over the household, and say to him, Behold, the Lord will hurl you away violently, O you strong man. He will seize firm hold of you and whirl you around and throw you like a ball into a wide land. There you shall die, and there shall be your glorious chariots, you shame of your master's house. I will thus thrust you from your office, and you will be pulled down from your station. This sets us up for the passage involving the symbol of the key. Isaiah then prophesies what will happen after Shebna is removed from office. In that day I will call my servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and I will clothe him with your robe, and will bind your sash on him, and will commit your authority to his hand. And he shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. And I will place on his shoulder the key of the house of David. He shall open, and none shall shut. He shall shut, and none shall open. Here, the key of the house of David symbolizes the authority that Shebna and Eliakim had over the royal house, as illustrated by the statement that he shall open and none shall shut, and he shall shut and none shall open. Jesus updates both of these statements from Isaiah 22 to reflect the new context in which he's using them. First, Jesus is not just giving Peter the key of the house of David, although as the messianic successor of David, Jesus could have done exactly that. But no, Jesus is not interested in running a political kingdom. As Jesus said in John 18:36, "My kingdom is not of this world." What Jesus is interested in is the kingdom of God, which Matthew regularly refers to by substituting the word heaven for God. And so, in Matthew 16, Jesus gives Peter the keys of the kingdom of heaven, that is, the kingdom of God or the church. Peter was thus being given more expansive authority than Shebna and Eliakim. Instead of ruling over a small Middle Eastern kingdom, Peter was being made the chief steward of the house of great David's greater son and his universal kingdom. And this isn't just something recognized by Catholics. In his book, Hard Sayings of the Bible, Baptist scholar F.F. Bruce wrote, "The keys of a royal or noble establishment were entrusted to the chief steward or major domo. He carried them on his shoulder in earlier times, and they served as a badge of the authority entrusted to him. About 700 BC, an oracle from God announced that this authority in the royal palace in Jerusalem was to be conferred on a man called Eliakim. I will place on his shoulder the key to the house of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open." So, in the new community that Jesus was about to build, Peter would be, so to speak, chief steward. In the early chapters of Acts, Peter is seen exercising this responsibility in the primitive church. Now, there's also something interesting about Jesus' citation of Isaiah 22, because the office of chief steward was an ongoing one in the house of David. In fact, Isaiah, Shebna, and Eliakim all lived centuries after the time of King David. So the office of chief steward spans centuries, with different individuals occupying the office. Isaiah 22 itself is a passage dealing with the succession from one chief steward to another. Back when I was becoming Catholic, I realized that this itself gives us reason to think that the office Jesus is appointing Peter to will also involve succession. At least if Jesus' church lasts more than one generation, somebody would need to succeed Peter in his office now that Jesus has created the position in the church. We may thus tentatively add to the list the fact that Christ's church has a succession of Petrine leaders. Jesus also updates Isaiah's statement about Eliakim that he shall open and none shall shut, and he shall shut and none shall open. In its original context in Isaiah's day in the 8th century BC, this clearly referred to the chief steward having the highest authority in the house of David, under the king himself, of course. He could do things that no other servant of the king could undo. But by the 1st century, when Jesus was speaking, a new idiom had come into usage, and so Jesus said that whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. To modern readers, this is a bit perplexing. What does binding and loosing mean? Though unclear to us, the answer would have been clear to Jesus' audience, for binding and loosing was an established mode of Jewish speech, and the 1906 Jewish Encyclopedia explains what is meant. Binding and loosing, rabbinical term for forbidden and permitted. The power of binding and loosing was always claimed by the Pharisees. Under Queen Alexandra, the Pharisees, says Josephus, became the administrators of all public affairs so as to be empowered to banish and readmit whom they pleased, as well as to loose and to bind. This does not mean that, as the learned men, they merely decided what, according to the law, was forbidden or allowed, but that they possessed and exercised the power of tying or untying a thing by the spell of their divine authority, just as they could, by the power vested in them, pronounce and revoke an anathema upon a person. The various schools had the power to bind and to loose, that is, to forbid and to permit. And they could bind any day by declaring it a fast day. This power and authority, vested in the rabbinical body of each age or in the Sanhedrin, received its ratification and final sanction from the celestial court of justice. In the New Testament, in this sense, Jesus, when appointing his disciples to be his successors, used the familiar formula. By these words, he virtually invested them with the same authority as that which he found belonging to the scribes and Pharisees, who bind heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but will not move them with one of their fingers, that is, loose them, as they have the power to do. So, binding and loosen was a Jewish idiom referring to the power to forbid things and to permit things authoritatively. In other words, to make authoritative rules of conduct or laws for the community of faith. In Matthew 18, Jesus gave the power to bind and loose to Peter, and so he gave Peter the authority to make laws for the Christian community. From this, we can conclude that the Church of Christ has laws. We've already got a good start on how Jesus understood his church, but now let's turn to the other passage where Jesus uses the term, and that is in Matthew 18. This is part of Matthew's discourse that encapsulates Jesus' teaching on internal church discipline, and here we find Jesus saying, "If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault, between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly, I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Here, there are several things we can learn. The first is that we're dealing with sin and discipline in the church, for Jesus says, if your brother sins against you, that is, a brother Christian. Jesus wants Christians who have been wronged to try to solve problems on the lowest level possible. Thus, he wants us to first go to the person that wronged us and try to work things out. Then, if that doesn't work, take a couple of other people along. Finally, if that doesn't work, present the case to the church. What we see is the principle that interpersonal conflict should be dealt with at the lowest level possible, and there is wisdom in doing it this way. In the first place, if you initially approach someone directly and privately, you're more likely to have a better chance of success. If you're talking to someone privately, you're showing him the courtesy of not airing his dirty laundry in public. He will be less defensive and more likely to reach an agreement than if you start by making his misdeeds public. Also, what Jesus is advising is in line with the golden rule of whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. Well, if someone believes that you have wronged them, what would you want? Would you want them to approach you about it privately, or would you want them to go behind your back or make your alleged fault public as their first step? Almost everybody would want to be approached directly and privately, so we have an obligation to approach them directly and privately. And I really wish people would follow this principle. Over my life, I've seen so many situations made worse by people failing to honor the golden rule and starting by going behind someone's back. People are excellent at self-justification, and so they're excellent at making excuses to justify this. They'll say that, well, this person might strike back if I confront them privately. I need to start by getting bigger guns on my side so I'll be safe. But Jesus didn't urge us to deal with perceived wrongs in the safest way possible. Safety is not his priority, as you can see by the cross. Love is Jesus' highest priority, and he wants us to deal with problems in the most loving way possible. Also, if you don't do that, if you deal with it in a less than loving way and begin by going behind someone's back or shouting their perceived wrongs from the housetops, it will generate an unloving response in return. You might or might not win a momentary battle, but you're likely setting yourself up for retaliation down the line. I'm not saying that there are no situations in which deviating from the principle that Jesus lays down in Matthew 18 is warranted, but such situations are comparatively rare. We're not to leap to that solution, much less make a habit out of it. I know it's hard, but in the majority of situations, we really need to follow the principle that Jesus lays down in Matthew 18 and start with direct, private conversations when we think someone has wronged us. But suppose that, in a particular case, this doesn't work. Neither does bringing along others, and so we ultimately have to take the matter to the church. What happens if the person won't listen even to the judgment of the church? In that case, Jesus says to let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. In this context, Gentiles and tax collectors were outsiders, people who were not accepted as members of the Jewish community. Gentiles were not members of the Jewish community at all, and tax collectors were people who were despised as sellouts to the Romans, who were oppressing their fellow Jews by engaging in Roman tax farming and usually charging excessive amounts. What Jesus is saying is that if your brother Christian wrongs you, and if he won't listen even to the church, then treat this person who was formerly an insider as if he were an outsider. What this shows us is that the church, as Jesus conceives it, has a clear membership. There are insiders, people who are members and known members, and there are outsiders, people who are non-members, either because they never joined or because they've been expelled. In other words, Jesus' church is a visible one. It's not an invisible spiritual union of all true believers. There would be no way to know who is or isn't a member of an invisible union. So we can add to our list, Christ's church has a visible membership. And that's not all, because later in history, we developed a term for treating former insiders as Gentiles or tax collectors, as outsiders. By expelling that person from communion with the church has excommunicated that person. So we can add that Christ's church has excommunication. And in order to impose such a sentence, the church must have judicial proceedings. So we can also add that Christ's church has judicial proceedings. Judicial proceedings, of course, involve the application of laws, and so it's no surprise that the next thing Jesus said was, "Truly, I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." So this underscores once again the fact that Christ's church has laws. Here in Matthew 18, we see Jesus sharing this power of binding and loosing, or the ability to make laws, more broadly than when he shared it with Peter. Only Peter received the keys of the kingdom, but the power to bind and loose is shared with church leadership more broadly. We've thus been able to determine rather a lot from the two passages where Jesus refers to his church using that term. We've seen that Christ's church is founded on Peter, since Jesus said he would build his church on him. This means that Christ's church has leaders, and since Christ is basing the keys he gives to Peter off the successive office of the chief steward of the house of David, that suggests that Christ's church has a succession of Petrine leaders. Since he gave Peter and others the power to bind and loose, that means Christ's church has laws. Christ's church has a visible membership that is subject to those laws, but if someone disobeys the laws, Christ's church has judicial proceedings, and one of the penalties that can result is expulsion from Christ's church, so it has excommunication. Since the gates of Hades will not prevail against it, this means that Christ's church will never die, and that means that Christ's church has been around since the first century. So, how well do contemporary groups fit with Jesus' understanding of his church? We'll start with the Protestant ones, which typically assume the invisible church model. How does that compare to what Jesus says? Not well. There are multiple factors here that indicate Jesus is talking about a visible church, not an invisible one. First, Jesus gives Peter the keys to his kingdom, following the custom of the chief steward of the house of David in the Old Testament. Peter is thus the chief steward of the house of the new David. By instituting Peter as his chief steward, Jesus makes Peter the church's earthly leader in his absence. But an invisible, non-institutional set of believers does not need an earthly leader. Second, Jesus gives Peter the authority to bind and loose, which have reference to the establishment, modification, and repeal of authoritative rules of conduct for the community, or laws. But an invisible set of believers needs no such disciplinary rules, only visible institutions do. Third, in Matthew 18, Jesus indicated that the church has judicial proceedings to deal with errant members who break the laws, and judicial proceedings are things that a visible church rather than an invisible union of believers has. Fourth, he indicates that his church has the power of excommunication, so it can expel members. But an invisible body has no need of the power of excommunication. Only visible institutional bodies need the ability to shear off diseased members who are trying to remain within it. Since Jesus indicates that his church will be a visible church, that disproves the common Protestant idea of the church as an invisible union. This also means that none of the Protestant churches fully correspond to the reality of Jesus' church, since Jesus founded his church in the first century, and it's been around since then. However, the Protestant churches only go back to the 1500s, and so none of them have the reality of what Jesus said his church would. What about the other more historic branches of Christianity, like the Eastern and Oriental Orthodox that were around before Protestantism arose? These churches do have roots that go back into truly ancient times, and so, like the Catholic Church, they can appeal to that fact. But the divisions that exist between these bodies, not to mention the schisms that still exist within them, mean that they aren't all united. At various points in history, separations occurred, and that leads to the question of who separated from whom. On this, there are different claims. The first split to occur was between the Oriental Orthodox and other Christians. According to Oriental Orthodox, other Christians separated from them, but according to other Christians, the reverse was true. The next major split was between Eastern Orthodox and Catholics. According to Eastern Orthodox, Catholics split from them, but according to Catholics, the reverse is true. Sorting out who separated from whom is tricky and involves a lot of subjectivity, but from my perspective, one of the best ways to cut through the confusion is to look back at what Jesus intended for his church based on what he says in Matthew 16 and 18. We know that he founded his church on Peter, and so if you wanted to be part of Jesus' church in the apostolic age, you needed to be in union with Peter. The question for us is, what about later ages? Is Peter meant to have a successor that we need to be in union with? As I pointed out in this video, the office that Jesus gives to Peter, being chief steward of the house of the new David, is based on an office that was successive. There were chief stewards of the house of David over centuries, and the passage that Jesus is cited in giving Peter his commission itself involves the succession from one chief steward to another. This strongly suggests that if Jesus did not return in the first century, that Peter's office would also have successors. Furthermore, if Jesus determined that his church needed a leader in the first century, when it was tiny and only had a few thousand members, then it would obviously need one today, when the Christian community is literally billions of people. You need a leader now even more. I thus think that the idea that Christ's church is meant to have a succession of leaders stemming from St. Peter, that is, a succession of popes, is very well grounded. And that tells us which of the more historic branches of Christianity fully corresponds to Jesus' intentions for his church. It's the Catholic Church. Now, there's obviously more we can say about all this, and we can discuss it in future episodes. But if we look at what Jesus actually had to say about his church, even just in the passages where he uses that term, it's clear that if you want to honor the will of Christ and be part of the church he founded, you need to be Catholic. If you like this content, you can help me out by liking, commenting, writing a review, sharing the podcast, and subscribing. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure and hit the bell notification so you'll always get notified when I have a new video, and you can help me keep making the podcast and get early access to new episodes by going to patreon.com/Jimmy Akin Podcast. Thank you. I'll see you next time, and God bless you.
learning what the Gospels can reveal as Jesus talks about his church. Great stuff from Jimmy Akin this week. You can find it easily wherever you stream. Just subscribe so you don't miss future episodes, or hang out at Podcast Central. That's EWTN.com/podcast. I'm Ace McKay. Going to bug out and enjoy the rest of the weekend. You do the same. Remember, of course, you can check in not only with Catholics Coast to Coast weekly on EWTN Radio, but also on EWTN Radio Extra. So download the app and stream anytime, anywhere. And remember, let God define who you are, and I'll see you again with Catholics Coast to Coast.